How dare you?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Read my lips.
Hell yes, we're gonna take your AR-15.
It's waiting out.
I have a dream.
Thank you.
Welcome, Daniel, to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Yes, thank you, Sondre. I think it's great to be here with you.
The author of a great book that I picked up the copy a while ago, actually, of Nixon's War at Home, the FBI, Leftist Guerillas, and the Origins of Counterterrorism. And that's just up my alley. Thought it was really interesting, but and we have a lot to talk about. We'll see how long this podcast will be. But so I'm just warning the listeners already. But yeah, take us through, the main points of your book. What story are you telling in this book?
Yeah, thank you. So I came to this book with a background in myself personally in radical movements in the United States in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then later went back to school to finish my undergraduate degree and was interested in studying radical movements from the 60s and 70s, partly because I had connections to some people who had been in them. And this included, I had known people who'd been in leftist guerrilla groups from the 60s and 70s, people who were inspired in the United States by guerrilla movements around the world, whether it's the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam, who were fighting the U.S. military invasion, Che Guevara, and and other Latin American revolutionaries. And some of listeners might be familiar with Red Army Faction in Germany and other European groups who imported some of those strategies in the 60s and 70s. But in the United States, there were groups called the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army, and there were several others, although those are two that I focus on in my book. So I knew when I ended up going to graduate school in history, and I knew I wanted to study these groups. Moving forward, long story short, as in the post 9/11 era, as I was looking at FBI documents, where the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that's the main intelligence agency in the United States that does domestic investigations and surveillance, I was looking at declassified documents where they're talking about groups like the Weather Underground that are carrying out bombings to protest U.S. imperialism and the U.S. war in Vietnam and racism in Black communities. This was a group of mostly white radicals. And I see the word terrorism creeping up. And not only I see the FBI and its director, J.Edgar Hoover, referring to these groups as terrorists, but also revolutionaries, radicals. But basically what I realized, what I was seeing here as I was in this post 9/11 era, where some groups on the radical left and the radical environmental movement in the U.S. had been framed as terrorists, I realized what I'm seeing here was the beginning, an origins of an American counterterrorism, and the origins of policing practices that were preemptive. That is, trying to stop violence before it happened through various means. And this involved bringing back some of the tactics that had been used against the Communist Party and alleged communists and socialists during the 40s and 50s and early 60s. Things like break-ins and warrantless wiretapping, mail opening, but it also and just mass surveillance of groups, including political suspect communities and racialized suspect communities. But it also involved creating new policing tactics in the name of fighting terrorism, right? And that included contingency plans for hostage situations. It included the first undercover operations. Before that, the FBI used informants, which is not the same as an undercover agent, but they had never sent their agents undercover. And that's something they start doing during this time. And there's new interagency task forces that are trying to improve coordination between police agencies, new training methods. So this is all happening as the U.S. national security state, right? This new set of surveillance agencies and emphasis on security is the priorities are kind of shifting here from anti-communism to anti-terrorism. There's a bigger jump after 9/11, but we see, and we don't. It's not inevitable that things were going to move in a straight line from the 70s to 9/11, but we see here now in retrospect that a lot of this important shift in national security priorities happened here. I could say a little bit more about some of the interventions of the book. Should I? Yeah, I mean, continue a little more.
Yeah, just keep going. I'm just going to add that exactly. I just want to point out that very often when we talk about terrorism, it seems like it's a new phenomenon. It's something that happened on 9/11 almost. That's the starting point for a lot of people. Or they go back, a few thousand years, and or you get those kind of meaningless point about, well, terrorism has always been part of conflict. And it's like, well, but we're trying to figure out, is this a specific phenomena or what is it? And I think that's where you talked about it already, but I think that's where, a lot of good things, in your book, because you can actually point to, a more concrete history here, I think, of the phenomenon. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great point. And I think that there's now, as the field of terrorism studies and the subfield of critical terrorism studies is dominated by social scientists. And, social scientists' research is wonderful, but, even when the field of critical terrorism studies, which, your doctoral advisor, Richard Jackson, was a key part of, they said one of the problems of terrorism studies is there's not enough historical research. Yep. And I think that's even still been true of critical terrorism studies. But I do think that we're kind of reaching a little bit of a critical mass of some important historical studies. Silke Zoller just came out with a new book, To Deter and Punish: Global Collaboration Against Terrorism in the 1970s. And Richard English's work is very important. T.K. Wilson at St. Andrews' book on Killing Strangers. So I think we're in and there's a new book on Canadian counterterrorism coming out. So and Lisa Stampnitzky's work, Disciplining Terror, is really foundational too. So So yeah, I think so. There was, I think we can trace like antecedents to the kind of terrorism and counterterrorism that developed in the 1970s. I mean, the term has its origins in the French Revolution in terms of kind of tactics of non-state actors rebelling against states, like anarchists or nationalists using dynamite or assassination in the late 19th, early 20th century. Or you have right-wing groups like the Klan in the United States and fascists in Europe. But one of the things that changes and is significant in the 70s, two things. One that I think I didn't emphasize as much in my book is there is some change in tactics because of new technology available, satellite television, jet airplane, commercial airliners. But it gets framed as terrorism. And this is something I really emphasize. And this is where I'm drawing from Lisa Stampnitzky's work, Disciplining Terrorism. Like this wasn't called... It might have been used, and it might have been used affirmatively by some leftists or insurgents, like the term terrorism. But the meaning as a sort of existential threat to Western civilization, to democracy, and as something that was just so heinous, like that we don't even want to understand it. Like it's and that the idea of trying to talk about its origins or where it comes from, or like terrorists as rational actors, is just off the table. That's where it's similar to the discussion in the United States about communism in the early Cold War and the Red Scare period, the period of the second Red Scare after World War II. So that's like, if we're going to understand a history of terrorism and counterterrorism, like that's a major development. And I really would say counterterrorism as we know it, understand today, it really has its origins in this period, in the 70s. And in the United States, that's the era of the presidency of Richard Nixon, who's most well known for resigning because of the Watergate scandal. But another thing I show in my book is that actually this, a bureaucratic conflict within the FBI and between the famed FBI director, J.Edgar Hoover, and Richard Nixon himself, who were old friends going back to the Cold War era, a bureaucratic conflict between them over how to deal with these leftist guerrilla groups and who should deal with them, what kind of tactics should be used, including illegal surveillance tactics, under whose jurisdiction, who's going to put it in writing that they're approving these kind of techniques. That is a big part of the story of what leads to Watergate. And I can explain that more, but that's another, in addition to explaining that the origins of this counterterrorism in the 70s, the other big argument in the historiography is that, you know, this history shows us an important part of the origins of Watergate as an unintended consequence of this conflict that has broader roots in these longstanding conflicts, including U.S. imperialism, the war in Vietnam, racist police violence in American cities, political repression. So yeah.
It's a complicated history, you know, and as a Norwegian, you know, we know a fair few things about America, but there's so much else that, you know, obviously there's a lot of things that we don't know, and I actually I would like you to just because you did mention it, but just that when you talk about Watergate, also, I mean, having just watched a movie about Watergate, you know, that's primarily been my interest. You sort of helped to tear down that whole almost glorification, I guess, of Woodward and Bernstein. But
yeah,
but it's fascinating to think. So and this is kind of, you know, I'd like you to expound on more here. It's just that bureaucratic conflict. Because you talk about bureaucrats, well, a lot of people talk about bureaucrats in a disparaging manner, or it's like belittling all these bureaucrats. But I think what you trace in your book is just how powerful and how impactful bureaucratic conflict can actually be, and so that's one, and then how it impacts counterterrorism, you know, the trajectory. But we can just, you know, take the listener through, you know, some more of that conflict.
Sure. And yeah, a big part of this story is how a lot of this counterterrorism that develops is limited in its effectiveness and sometimes even counterproductive and has all these unintended consequences. And the bureaucratic conflict is part of that. I think what I should back up, and I'm happy to explain this, I think to give a little more context, I think I want to say a few things about the FBI and American society and the rising protest movement of the 60s. To give the context to explain this bureaucratic conflict. But what happens, Norwegian listeners might have a general familiarity with that in the United States in the 1960s. It's the period of the counterculture, the civil rights movement for African Americans, the women's movement, and a big movement against the war in Vietnam, which, you know, you had in Europe as well. So J.Edgar Hoover is and there's a new biography that's just coming out by Beverly Gage that I'm really excited to read on a political biography of J.Edgar Hoover, a really consequential figure in 20th century American history, politics. But J.Edgar Hoover had, you know, had started his career in the Justice Department, which oversees the FBI, at the end of World War I, and was involved in the first Red Scare against, you know, rounding up radicals and a lot of immigrant radicals in the labor movement, and then later becomes head of the FBI in 1924. And he really builds up the FBI as a very powerful institution that really has a great deal of political autonomy from the White House, the presidency, and from Congress. And part of the way he develops that power, in addition, part of it is by being a bureaucrat, and he had worked as an attorney in law when he was in law school at Georgetown. He worked at the Library of Congress, and he learned the Dewey Decimal System and how to catalog people's names into these different security lists, and developed these files, and he realized the power in that. But he, in addition to that, he took great care to promote the FBI's image. There was this idea of the G-man, the government man, who were these young white male FBI agents with clean-cut haircuts, and, you know, they were defending America from national security and fighting crime in the Cold War. And there was even an FBI TV show that, you know, he helped promote. But in the 60s, as there was greater protests, there was more protest movements, and he was aging, entering his 70s, he was worried about leaks. He was worried that, and there were some people calling from in Congress and elsewhere in the society for more oversight of the FBI, and he was worried that leaks. He knew that after World War II, the FBI had used all these break-ins and other illegal tactics to go after the Communist Party, and he banned those activities. He banned the break-ins, the mail opening, the warrantless wiretapping, because he was concerned that if that information about the FBI involved in that illegal activity ever leaked to the public, it would undermine the FBI's power and image, and which as he's aging, he really wants to protect. But you have, as people are trying to end the war in Vietnam, and the war keeps expanding, and it's expanded under a liberal president, Lyndon B. Johnson. There's a faction within the youth anti-war movement, and then also in the Black Power movement coming out of the Black Panther Party, which is an important Black radical socialist organization. There's factions within those groups that are inspired by this kind of urban guerrilla strategy being promoted within the international left. There's a split, and there's some people who are wanting to follow this road that Che Guevara has promoted, and Regis Debray, who was a French Marxist scholar, wrote a book promoting this idea of a Foucault theory. So they're inspired by that. So there's a series of my book. Several of the chapters open with some of these flashpoint events. Chapter 1 talks about anti-war bombers in Denver, Colorado, in the Rocky Mountain area where there was a lot of defense tech industry or war industries, and there was a bombing on Nixon's inauguration day there. And one of the leaders of that bombing, Cameron Bishop, was put on the FBI's list of most wanted criminals. And he was the first leftist radical to go on there. But over the next few years, there's so many leftist radicals on the list that they expand the list from the top 10 to the top 14. And most of them, the vast majority are radicals, and most of them involved in the guerrilla struggle in some way. But anyway, there's another incident in March 1970 where members of the Weather Underground accidentally blow themselves up, and they're building an anti-personnel bomb that they were going to use against a dance for Army officers. There was an incident in August 1970, a young Black radical named Jonathan Jackson does an armed raid on a courthouse. It turns into a bloody incident, and he and others die. The Black Liberation Army in May 1971 starts assassinating police officers. And then an international event in September 1972, the Palestinian nationalist organization Black September, which is a sub-faction of other groups, carries out an attack on the Israeli men's Olympic team, and it's a hostage situation, and also ends in a bloodbath. So all of these are, and that's some of your listeners might be familiar with, and that's one that the Munich attacks is something that we also then think of as like a key point in the origins of this international discourse and concerns about international terrorism. But I'm arguing that the U.S. response had to do with responses with the conflict with these domestic guerrilla groups over the previous 4 years before that. So all of those flashpoint events and others create these crises. And Nixon is getting on the phone with Hoover, and they had been old friends. Like Hoover and Nixon were key players in the early Cold War Red Scare. But Nixon expected Hoover to just go along with what he wanted, but Hoover had these other concerns that I just mentioned. So at all of these points, the kind of the pressure is on, and Nixon is kind of going against. Hoover is resisting. A key moment there is there's something called the Houston Plan, and this would have been America's first institution explicitly dedicated to fighting something called terrorism. And it happened after that townhouse bombing I just mentioned. It was a staffer for Nixon named Tom Houston, who was from a far right conservative background too, and was a staffer. And he was communicating with William Sullivan, who was head of the domestic security division within the FBI and oversaw the famous COINTELPRO or counterintelligence domestic operations against the Black Panthers and other groups, which I could also talk about. That's a whole nother part of this story. But Sullivan was concerned that Hoover was focused on an outdated threat of communism and he needed to do more about these guerrillas. He also had ambitions to become head of the FBI, but he, behind Hoover's back, works with Houston to develop this plan that for basically a new government agency that would have had an appointed member in the White House cabinet under the Nixon administration. And that this kind of agency would have been a clearinghouse that would have brought all of the federal intelligence agencies together. So in addition to the FBI, there's a Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, which does international affairs, the National Security Agency, which does communication, and then the military intelligence agencies. It would have brought them under direct White House control and would have brought back all of those illegal surveillance tactics, and much of it in the name of fighting terrorism. And Hoover tanked it. I'm using a little slang. Sorry, torpedoed it. He brought it down because he saw this as the White House taking control over too much oversight and trying to creep into his jurisdiction. And he went to the Attorney General and said, "I'm not going to do any of these this illegal surveillance unless the White House or the Justice Department signs off on every single one." And the Attorney General convinced Nixon this is more trouble than it's worth, because Nixon didn't want the leaks either. So, but that really turns this bureaucratic conflict into what was a simmering tensions into a really full blown bureaucratic conflict. And then there's some of these other incidents happens. Hoover ends up bringing back some of those illegal surveillance tactics anyway, but informally, and doesn't even tell Nixon, right? And that creates problems too, because FBI agents start doing break-ins, but they're worried that if they get caught, is headquarters going to back them up? That creates that problem simmers. But what happens is Nixon then, in summer of 1971, a man named Daniel Ellsberg, who's a policy analyst with the Rand Corporation, famously leaks this massive report, classified report called the Pentagon Papers, and they're published in the Washington Post. There's a film about it called The Post. But when that happens, the report shows that every U.S. president, from Harry Truman through Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had lied about the U.S. war in Vietnam. And Nixon was worried that there was going to be information about him and some of his crimes that would come forward. So he wanted Hoover to use some of these tactics against Ellsberg, and Hoover refused. That's where he kind of drew a line. And that's when Hoover decides to make his own team, or some of his aides form their own team of secret operatives, and they become known as the Plumbers. And that's who gets caught breaking into the Watergate hotel. And then the scandal continues from there, and it's interwoven even more with the conflict over leftist guerrilla violence. But sorry, that took a little while.
No, that's fine, and I
explain it.
And just when you're talking about the Plumbers, which almost sounds like some kind of backing band, or studio musicians. But the Plumbers, Watergate, and if I remember correctly, Mark Felt, Deep Throat. That's also a can we say this a consequence of this bureaucratic, conflict? Yeah, absolutely. So some people who might be familiar with the Watergate scandal, which ultimately brings down Nixon, know that there is, and if you've seen the movie All the President's Men, based on the book by Bob Woodward and Bernstein, Woodward and Bernstein, they're meeting with this secret operative who is known as Deep Throat, and it was never. There were suspicions about who Deep Throat was, but this person was feeding information about the FBI's Watergate investigation to the Washington Post, and actually lesser known to Time magazine, other media sources as well. The Washington Post has gotten more of the credit because of that film and that important book. But I think it was around 2006, Mark Felt, as he was aging and actually had dementia, came out and admitted that he'd been
Deep Throat. Now, he had been the associate director of the FBI, the number 2 most powerful person in the FBI. And I'm going to back up and explain his story in a moment. But the other thing that he was known for was that in the late 1970s, after Watergate, and after a lot of information about the various FBI and other intelligence agencies' covert operations that involve civil liberties violations, and even worse, in the CIA, we're talking about assassinations, and the FBI even promoted violence that led to deaths, particularly in the Black Panther Party. After all this has kind of come out, the Mark Felt and a couple other FBI officials are charged with authorizing illegal surveillance, and Felt and Edward Miller, who ends up becoming the head of domestic intelligence after Sullivan, they are both convicted, but they're convicted in 1980 for those crimes. But then as soon as Ronald Reagan comes into office after his election in 1980, which is part of a big wave of conservatism in American politics and a rise of the American right, and Reagan's presidency and even his election, anti-terrorism, partly because of the Iran hostage crisis in 1979 through 80, becomes a big thing that he focuses on. And he pardons both of those men. But to back up, what happened with Felt was Hoover realized towards the end of his life that Sullivan was going behind his back. And Hoover promoted Felt as a way to try to keep Sullivan in check. And then Felt, once Hoover dies in May 1972, he agrees on the need to officially authorize the break-ins, but he was a Hoover loyalist and he resented the fact that Nixon, once Hoover died, immediately appointed a lackey, somebody who was a Nixon loyalist, who did not have experience in the FBI. It was L. Patrick Gray, a former Navy officer who had only recently been appointed as an assistant attorney general in the Justice Department, and he was brought in. So, and Felt is the number 2 person. Gray doesn't is inexperienced, and he's also kind of on a public relations tour through much of his year in office. And it's really Mark Felt who's running the FBI. And he's both dealing with the Weather Underground investigation, trying to bring back these break-ins. And he starts basically doing what you might call a counterintelligence operation against L. Patrick Gray and Nixon by releasing this information about the Watergate investigation. Meanwhile, while he's also trying to find a way to reauthorize break-ins, and it's ironic, right? Because Nixon's plumbers did a break-in into the Democratic National Convention, and that's where they got caught, and leads to the Watergate scandal. And they had done a couple other break-ins before that. Felt is authorizing the same sorts of break-ins. It's just he sees that he's willing to do them to fight what he calls terrorism, but not for this kind of more just overtly partisan political maneuvers that Nixon is doing. So, but when that Munich attack happens, that is immediately kind of creates an international crisis that is used by Felt to immediately start to authorize these break-ins against the Weather Underground, but also against suspected Palestinian nationalists in the U.S. And there's a break-in targeting Palestinian nationalists and supporters of the Palestinian cause, and a broader harassment of people of Arab descent in the U.S. that I refer to as the Arab Scare. Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of where this figure Felt, who's kind of been this enigmatic figure in American politics in the 70s, kind of fits into this story. So thanks for asking about that.
I loved reading about that. This narrative of the history, and you see how these players, it's almost like a Game of Thrones, like in modern popular terms, where you're trying to play the game for these positions, and your incentive are to fight for your positions within the system, and you don't like that guy. It's like I think that was quite fascinating when you. It's fascinating. It's a little bit silly, but then you recognize that these are the most powerful agencies in the world, with the power to do almost anything, except for actually catching the Weather Underground or these groups. Because I mean, that's part of the story, right? Is that and the part of the frustration, which I think we can sort of take into the modern discussion about counterterrorism. But a big part of what you're talking about is that we have all these resources being spent on finding the Weather Underground and fighting the BLA. But I guess the BLA was easier in a way because they were actually attacking more or putting themselves in harm's way. But the Weather Underground was a little more clandestine in that sense. But you have all these resources and time and energy, and you're not catching them. Bernardine Dorn, for example, is still escaping the leader of the Weather Underground. It's still on the loose here. So isn't that just part of this story is that you spend all these resources, but it's not working.
Yeah. There's that. Thank you so much. And there's 2 points I want to make about that. One is that, like I mentioned, my background came on the radical left, and the way I won't get into too many of the names of the figures in the books, but kind of the way I understood the FBI during this time, I think overstated their power. I think there's this idea that the FBI just would go after any group that they saw as a threat, any ideas that were different, that were left, and try to destroy them all. And the surveillance web was massive, but there was change over time. And like, a important part of this is showing that it's a lot more complicated than that. And like, even the broad left or liberal coalition protest movements actually had a good amount of power. Ultimately, if we look back over the longer term, the power of the right as an organized force, I think, was greater. But in that time, I mean, we have in the 1970s these massive investigations of intelligence agencies that happen. The FBI ends up cutting back like over 80% of its surveillance operations to really just focus on violence prevention and counterterrorism. The Attorney General puts in new guidelines for FBI operations that are pretty strict. They get rolled back the 80s and then even more so after 9/11. But that's important. But the second thing too, is that they can't find. They also, to show the limits of their power, they really can't find the Weather Underground. They came close a couple times, and a lot of that had to do with a kind of luck. There's a thing, I used FBI documents. I'm sorry. In addition to the FBI documents, I used a series of oral histories of FBI agents that had been conducted by a society of former FBI officials and then published the transcripts online. They're no longer available, but I used them. And so one of the things one of those officers talked about was what he called serendipity. This idea that the way counterterrorism becomes effective is that you create this massive archive of intelligence, and you spread information through all kinds of police agencies. And you're trying to infiltrate the underground, but these groups that have become clandestine, they have fake IDs. They've cut off all ties with even family members, even their parents, and they're hiding. It's really difficult to find them, almost, and they're not successful in infiltrating the underground. I can explain a couple small exceptions to that, but this guy talks about serendipity is like, it's really, you're waiting, you're spending all these resources and basically waiting for the guerrillas to make a mistake. And as you mentioned, I talk about the Black Liberation Army. Part of it is because they're black and because of racism, that they can't get away with just like going into casing the Capitol building and planting a bomb in a men's room or a women's room. But it's also, they do more things like police assassinations, and they're robbing drug dealers, and that is riskier and leads to, and part of they were doing that too is because they didn't have funding. There were some members of the Weather Underground who were pretty wealthy, had some access to some family money. They were able to contribute, or they were able to do shoplift in a way that black radicals wouldn't be able to do as much. So, but I think going back to, how this relates to the present and your work that I'm looking forward to talking about more is these counterterrorism operatives are kind of doing a form of crisis management. I mean, their job is not to think about the larger historical context. What are the root causes of violence? Thinking about the war in Vietnam. It's really their job is to find people who are carrying out bombings, and it includes right-wing people too. Although the history is more of this this surveillance focuses a lot more on the left. But anyway, so yeah, they legitimately don't want bombing, or especially something that's deadly, to happen on their watch, morally, or just in terms of their job, and in terms of the backlash they're going to get. And that creates a problem for them, and that's part of the picture.
Yeah, I think it's. I think you mentioned it. I mean, if people want to, get to know more about the Weather Underground, I do recommend this podcast series it's called Mother Country Radicals. I think about where I think is it Said Dorn, the son of Bernardine, who's the host, and he takes who's through his history and his family's history, I guess, of the Weather Underground, and you also wrote an op-ed, I guess, Daniel, about the podcast, which gives quite a holistic take on it, but it's still an interesting insight into the Weather Underground. And one thing that I'm pretty sure that if my memory serves me right now, that you mentioned it as well. There's an example, isn't it, of they talk about on the podcast about how they learned that they had taken underwear from Bernardine Dorn. As a
it was her sister, Jennifer Dorn.
Yeah, as a gift to the police, like, this is how close we got. But I listened to the podcast before I read your book. And so I listened to that story, and and then you get that side of it, but then you also mention it, and in a way, it's sort of like emblematic of like the hunt for the Weather Underground. It's like you take the underwear, and you're so happy about that, and it's like as a trophy.
Yeah, it's a pretty perverse story, but so Jennifer Dorn, I mean, we now know she's basically what we might call a topsider. I mean, she was somebody who had a connection to, she really did have a connection to the underground, but she was an above ground person. She was not, in hiding. And so she was one of the main people the FBI really focused on to try to find the underground. And they broke into her apartment multiple times. They even like discussed trying to when she they had her under surveillance while she was pregnant. They even discussed like kidnapping her child as a way to get her to turn in her sister Bernardine Dorn. They didn't follow through with that plan, but they did all these break-ins, and that included like when the head of the unit that was doing these break-ins in the FBI retired, they gave him somebody at a party gave a pair of her underwear to him, and I guess they thought it was a joke, but to her, that was really, to find that out was, really disturbing. But it also speaks to their frustration. I mean, and they're trying to find these people and not having any luck.
Yeah, I think it's. In a way, it's fascinating history. And then I think when we walk through, I mean, the 1970s are really important. You talk about the lead up to it, but then. And then when we're talking about, how these, FBI and stuff worked here and overstating the powers and whatever, this carries over right into the 1980s when you have terrorism experts in air quotes here who also make up terrorist groups. I mean, they're seeing terrorist groups everywhere. You have that infamous conference in London in the 80s where they talk about the Basque violence, and they decide without visiting Spain or the Basque countries that terrorism is the problem, and they make up a new terrorism group that nobody's ever heard of. It doesn't exist either, but it doesn't matter. There's a lot of fantasy going on in counterterrorism, and I think in one way, I mean, when you think about Weather Underground and the BLA, they arise out of real issues. I think a problem in counterterrorism is that they traditionally, I think it's true today, and it's been true. I think it's been true, for many decades. Is that there really aren't that many terrorists out there. So when you spend this many resources on fighting or countering or hunting for them, you end up chasing ghosts, as John Mueller and Mark Stewart says, because there are real threats out there, but there are not that many. So, but when you use all those resources and you hunt for them, well, then you start seeing things, and you read into things that doesn't really exist. And I want to use that as a segue into one of the main points I think in your book, at least the one that I took away from it is, and you mentioned it in the chapter about police killing, because you have the BLA ambushes the police, and you have this. The quotes here from Hoover and Nixon talking about all they talk about is the poverty as a reason and all that kind of stuff, but then Nixon says but that's not the reason these people are bad people, and I think this is a crux. This is a really important element, because you have elements of real violence that should be condemned. But then you have it's tabooed. They're blind to the causes. It's just, these are bad people. And this is my impression, is that when you look at today's trend, you have the protest and the Black Lives Matter. That's nothing new. It's like, this is a much larger historical trend, and these are issues. And I often look at violence as symptoms that, that are being forced to the onto the top. They're not being hidden, but they're forced up, like a volcano, like an eruption, basically. But in going through your book, could you just talk about I guess United States, but also this how the real causes or the root causes, and discussing those, are tabooed, and how they're not talking about it is just, these are bad people and we need to fight them. I mean, there's a question in there. I hope you can find it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I guess there's two parts to that. One is that in trying to look at the history of these guerrilla groups, I wanted to try to really take seriously about their motives and talk about where they're coming from. And they are responding to massive state violence. The war in Vietnam, which is a war of aggression by the United States, supporting a puppet regime in South Vietnam against a popular insurgency, and then later against North Vietnam. It leads to over 3 million people dying, and that include that's 3 million people in Southeast Asia, plus more than 52,000 American troops. So one of the things about Nixon is we now know that he actually sabotaged peace efforts at the end of Johnson's administration, like secretly sabotaged them because he thought it would help him get elected, and he ends up extending the war that could have been over in 1968, 1969. Yeah. And then the police violence, particularly disproportionately, it's mostly working class and poor communities, and particularly urban, and then disproportionately Black communities, was a longstanding problem too. At the same time, I'm taking that seriously. I'm also looking critically at the strategic choices that movements made, and that's where something that I think in a recent literature hasn't been done enough, I would say. I mean, I think there's a tendency at romanticization of some of these paramilitary groups, and Cedric Johnson is a scholar who's getting into talking about radical nostalgia and some of the problems with that historically and in terms of the political ramifications. So, but what part of what emerges here is something that Lisa Stampnitsky calls a politics of anti-knowledge. And she's really focusing on the Bush administration after 9/11 with that, where you're with us, Bush says you're with us or you're with the terrorists, and kind of any discussion of nuance or understanding motives is really off the table, and even implicates you as a terrorism supporter. But what I found, and that example is sort of one of them, is some of the origins of this. So there was a big government, U.S. federal government supported report that came out in 68 or 69. It's called the Kerner Commission report. And this was after a series of the riots or urban uprisings that had happened in hundreds of American cities in the summers in the 60s, most of them triggered by incidents of police violence, and then also in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and it's trying to find the causes. And what this report famously said was, racial segregation and economic inequality, poverty, are the root causes of civil disturbance and crime. And that's not to excuse any kind of violence, but it's to understand that in order to have a more peaceful society, basically we need to expand the social democracy that was established in the United States in the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, and under Johnson, with the Great Society so that we don't have poverty and racism in America anymore. And that was basically ignored. And Nixon, who runs on a campaign of law and order, is really focusing on saying, it's, all these intellectuals, these professors, these activists, they all say that, there's something wrong with America. But he says the problem is that people decide which laws they can break and which ones they don't want to break. Of course, he's breaking all kinds of laws. He doesn't care about law. He cares about order. Yeah. But that's an example of when they're talking about these. He's like, oh, the New York, they're on this private phone conversation that was recorded and that I was able to access. They're using that law and order banter and their pessimism about the New York Times wanting to talk about environmental causes for violence, and they're saying these are bad people, and that's the way terrorists. So people framed as terrorists end up being discussed by a lot of these officials. So, so this it moves a lot of the conversation away from talking about those root causes, which is what you focus so much of your work on, and trying to understand alternative ways of dealing with political violence, right?
I think it's fascinating too, because it's like, even when we're talking, we're having this discussion, it's obvious that it's academic oriented and we want to understand things. We still have to preface it by saying that we're not trying to excuse violence, because and because in a way that's a given. You don't accept violence. It should be condemned in any form. But then what's happened, and a lot of terrorism scholars have talked about this, since the 80s, especially the kind of people that were coming up then, about how they were tired of trying to understand terrorism, but then always have to defend themselves against critics and saying that, trying to understand is not the same as accepting or condoning violence. And we still have, in some ways, have to do that. And I think that's, that's an interesting point that carries over from, the narrative that you tell in your book. And then also with the politics of anti-knowledge. I'm not sure if you have... if you know about this Cato report from 95, 96 by Ivan Elan, which it still baffles me that that they had a committee. I think it was in the CIA, or was it commissioned by Madeleine Albright, and they because the Pentagon, they had a working committee, I think, and they had the assumption that American military interventions abroad causes terrorism, and Ivan Elan from the Cato Institute went through all the cases and found that yes, your assumption is correct. If it's not causing, it definitely correlates. There's a strong correlation here. And I asked Ivan when I did my PhD, I sent him a message and I was like, whatever happened to that report of yours? And he said, well, initially they found it interesting, in a polite manner. Then they forgot about it. And then after 9/11, they definitely forgot about it. And I think that's really interesting, because it actually offers some empirical evidence as to why this international terrorism, if we can talk about, in that sense, happens, against American interest, and it's ignored. So I think that's another clear example of that politics of anti-knowledge, that there's nothing new, and and we sort of seem to continue that element. But then the other question is there a politics of anti-knowledge or specific knowledge that you want to advance, right? So you can talk about values and normative commitments. And when I read your book, Daniel, it's like, sometimes I'm not thinking they're not knowledgeable or they don't know about it, but they're ignoring it. And they're creating their own kind of knowledge, like, this old mantra from constructivism, that theory, and Robert Cox, that theory is always for someone and for a purpose. And I think that adds another sinister element to it, I think, if it's not even, well, I guess you can call it anti-knowledge, but it's more like a politics of our knowledge in a Trumpian way. It's like, I have my facts, and I'm just going to shamelessly pursue that. And, so I think there's a long strand here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that last point you just made, that I hadn't thought of it that way, and I think that's a really great point. Yeah, it's not just the politics of anti-knowledge; it's creating a new set of knowledge, and some of it, you mentioned just made up stuff. As an my American youth slang part coming through making shit up,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You know, like, sorry, but the in the 80s, there's really a part of sectors in right-wing think tanks that are really trying to figure out. They're upset about the restraints on FBI power and the power of the national security state that are instituted after Watergate and after these other hearings I mentioned, the church committee hearings, et cetera. And they're strategizing on how to roll that back and bring back the surveillance capacity of the early Cold War and institute something like the Houston Plan. And there's one figure I mentioned in the epilogue in my book, a guy named Samuel Francis, who's later becomes known as this paleo-conservative and promotes a lot of the kind of like replacement theory that's animating the far right, or even you could say neo-fascist right in the US and Europe currently. But he's a figure who ends up becoming a policy analyst for a young freshman congressman from North Carolina, who ends up being on this new Senate antiterrorism subcommittee after Reagan comes into office and after Republicans take the Senate, and in that subcommittee they draft new guidelines for the Attorney General that loosens up some of the guidelines for FBI activities. So that's an example of how the right takes some of this violence and then overinflates its significance, and sometimes even makes things up. There's a whole series of books that come out that are kind of off the wall, talking about terrorism threat and the Soviet Union's funding terrorism that really exaggerates things. And then some of the counter arguments against that, like the report you mentioned, some policymakers and people in government, especially on the right, are willfully pushing that away. So I do think there is like a building of an alternative set of knowledge that's based partly on inaccurate information, and that has precedence in anti-communism too. But
but this is, and I think this is one of the main elements from Lisa Stampnitz's work as well. Is just how to shape how we view terrorism, and one salient example of that is the Jerusalem Conference. I think it's in 1979, and you have Benjamin Netanyahu organizing here, and in a newsletter to his organization, they also describe just how happy they are with the news coverage, and they brag explicitly about framing how other people or Western countries view terrorism. So I think this is a big point, because terrorism has never been an objective phenomenon that we agree on. It's always been this. It's always been a contested concept. But I think, especially after 9/11, but also I think somewhat during the 90s, but at least after 9/11, this for many years this was just ignored. Terrorism is what the bad guys do on 9/11, which was horrific, but then that also just it takes away or ignores all the previous knowledge, or just a rich history of the concept, really, of how contested it is. And I think that's it's so important that we just remember that theories or concepts are from somewhere and for a purpose, right?
Right, they have a history themselves. But yeah, you're right. It's always been political, and just the controversy over that. The term terrorism has always been linked to these broader controversies over state violence and over surveillance and policing, and and who values, who's an enemy, who's in power. But I think this is a good way to transition. I mean, if you don't mind, you're, with all humility, since you're the host, but to talk about your work a little bit, but let me just say that, after 9/11, I was, I think 20 or 21 when those attacks happened. And I was living in Portland, Maine on the East Coast of the United States. And me and the people I was connected with protested even the invasion of Afghanistan, and that was not very popular. But I was physically assaulted by people on the street who are just trying to protest against this. It's so angry that you'd be questioning U.S. policy during this time, and that idea of questioning the war on terror, which is not acceptable. And when the Iraq invasion, which is based on lies, as we know, happened, you start to have a larger anti-war movement. But even then, initially a lot of pushback, and I was assaulted protesting that too, but and also by police. But I'm not trying to talk about myself, but it's just a transition to maybe give a Norwegian audience and others like a feel for that time period, and so we can come back to your work, and because I think what your work does is offers some ideas and solutions for an area that others had theorized about or criticized, but not offered concrete solutions. And that is like, how do we deal with political violence that's real and that hurts people, and and non-state political violence, what's typically called terrorism, while also not losing sight of the root causes and if I may, one of the ways that after I read your work, I initially reached out to you and we started this correspondence we've been having now for a couple of years or more. In the U.S. left, there's this discussion of prison abolition. It's recently in the BLM protests, there's a slogan, defund the police, has come through. And a lot of the concepts behind police and prison abolition is that, it's a form of state violence. We have mass incarceration in the U.S. It has class and racial components in terms of oppression and discrimination, and that it doesn't solve the root problems of violence. And in fact, it's like violence factories, taking people and putting them in this violent place, and then if they're ever released, sending them back into the society where they don't have resources to succeed, and it's just like this self-perpetuating cycle. So prison abolition has become really influential, but there's also discussion in the U.S. left about, is social democracy in Scandinavia a model for the U.S. and is maybe prison abolition distract from like building the kind of mass movements in labor and other constituencies of people to reach a kind of different political economy that would have maybe a different idea, different forms of policing. And then the question still, how do we deal with right-wing violence or other violence? And so I would just love to hear, I kind of gave a little bit of a spiel there. Maybe you could speak to some of that.
I mean, it's such an important and difficult question, because the insight or the point that you start from, and this was the starting point in my own research back in 2012 when I got into terrorism studies, was that it was so blatantly obvious that we were doing things wrong, or it was counterproductive. We were making terrorism into a self-fulfilling prophecy by killing more people and not really understanding the phenomenon of violence. And I've later tried to define violence in accordance with other political theorists such as Simon Critchley about how violence is a phenomenon with a history. So it's violence and counter-violence, and this creates a violent history, and it's very hard to break out of that cycle. And so that was kind of obvious that there's stuff that does not work, and I was thinking, we have all that human suffering, and the more normative drive of my research is to try and avoid human suffering, in line with the old emancipatory goal of the Frankfurt School, but they didn't really crack it, so we're still trying to crack it. But it's in the words of Ken Booth, we're trying to explore. Well, security is about giving people the opportunity to explore what it might mean to be human. And in there, I think lies, it's not easy, but then you're talking about, in a way, preventing, for example, terrorism by giving people options, different ways to live their life. And so in my own view, this is so, I have not worked on prisons or the prison system and defunding the police, which I don't think is realistic, and I'm not really sure it's helpful either. Although critical questions can be, pointed towards the police. But in my own work, then, what I try to do is that my own emancipatory project, such as it is, was to try and, first of all, I did create a model of counterterrorism, which was kind of idealistic. But then the point is that through my work in my master's degree and PhD, I looked to Norway, trying to not copy another famous American speech, but, I tried to look to Norway, my own country, because they had been involved in peace diplomacy. And peace diplomacy is a lot more about actually looking at the causes. And so then I went to Norwegian diplomats and I asked them, because I knew that they had negotiated with terrorists, something that we were told after 9/11 you cannot do. And we later had big academic discussions, and with Harmony Torres, for example, leading the way, saying that you should actually negotiate with terrorists. That's a good way of trying to end that political violence. And I talked to Norwegian diplomats, and they were like, "Well, we always done that. What are you academics on about? Of course you have to talk to them." And then I talked to people who sat in Colombia, in Sri Lanka, and other places, and they sat across, people at the table that they knew had perpetrated terrorism, but they still were people, and they still had those discussions, and they was able to move the peace process going by doing the things that we were told after 9/11 you cannot do, by having negotiations, by having talks. And that doesn't mean that it's always successful, as in Sri Lanka, which ended with a bloodshed and violence in the end anyway. But for many years, they were actually able to reduce levels of violence and try and build meaningful relations here. And so I think there's a potential here of it is possible to see these reasons and not condoning violence, but there's possible to see the reasons why it happens, and that is so important. So one of the main points of my model is to begin with the old Enlightenment principle of dare to know, which is something that the West produced, but that we have forgotten a lot about. And then what the only thing that I can do basically is to try and produce. I try to produce knowledge about why the war on terror or using violence is wrong and counterproductive, and how we can actually prevent terrorism by not bombing people all the time. We have to do more meaningful peace diplomacy. We have to do good old-fashioned politics, trying to establish those institutions. Like we didn't really try in Afghanistan, and look where that got us after 20 years. But if we had been more serious about building institutions, or letting the Afghans build their own institutions and supporting it, I think we could have prevented the backlash that we've seen with Taliban. So I can't speak to the prison or how to counter all violence, but I would say that the first principle would be actually dare to know, because all too often we don't dare. It's tabooed. We don't want to talk about these causes because it might reflect poorly on us. And then the other is the means ends consistency. You cannot create peace by using violent means. So that's the way that I try to look at it. I'm not sure how it applies to the prison system, but or in America now. But I'm thinking there's a lot of Americans that need to they have to dare to know now. You have to actually try and look it in the eye and see the society for what it is.
Yeah, and in addition to those principles, dare to know, and this means ends consistency, which sounds a lot like principles in prison abolition, or some of those theoretical ideas. But you outline what you call the natural disaster response to terrorism, which is different than a militaristic response. Would you be able to kind of explain what that would look like?
Well, I mean, it's, I think that the main point that I wanted to take, that I try to build in there is that we deal with natural disasters all the time. And we are going to deal with it a lot more given global warming. We have these systems in place, and then a terrorist attack, for example, involves trauma. So we have all these institutions and structures and systems that already have experience with dealing with trauma, so they can respond to this with their pre-existing knowledge. I mean, a terrorist attack, whether it's a terrorist attack, a massacre, a shooting, a bomb, doesn't really matter in terms of the actual consequences. Right, those have to be dealt with emergency services and the teams. Whether it's a mass shooting or terrorism, that's something that we argue about after the fact. So it doesn't really impact this thing. And then, so you have systems already in place in society with knowledge, experience to deal with trauma. But then my other point is that it's a way of normalizing the response. Right, so you have this extraordinary violence, but the point is that if that gets out of hand, like it did after 9/11, then you respond with more violence, then the point is that you will end up creating more violence as a consequence, because that's how violence works. At least in my view. Again, violence is a phenomenon with a history. You use violence, it creates counter-violence. That's basically, I think that's at least how I look at it. So by using that natural disaster model or approach, and it may not be the correct one, but that's the one that I used. My main point was that we have systems already in place which can normalize the response and avoid the trap of extraordinary measures, because those extraordinary measures can easily lead us down a path that will erode civil liberties, will kill a lot of people, and will cost a lot of resources. And so that is what I was trying to get at when using that model. But then that model is, we're getting quite technical here, but it's created as a Weberian ideal type, which is not a concept, like this is a definition, this is an ideal type. And my point when I put that out there is that this is initial work, and I want people to use the model and perhaps improve on the model. So, there could be other, I'm not saying that, this is, the one model to rule them all in terms of, a Lord of the Rings terminology. But I do think we need to, and John Mueller talked about this after 9/11, and he said, this is not a harbinger. This is a one-off. The terrorists got lucky, and we need to be careful about responding in extraordinary manner. So I'm not the first one to make this point, but I did try to make it into the model. So that's I think normalization and bringing the politics back in, and the politics of knowledge back in, I think was my main point here.
Yeah, and another important part of that natural disaster approach, which you lay out with the various points, is also not targeting suspect communities. Yep. As a part of that, avoiding the extraordinary measures or a super violent response. Yeah, and targeting suspect communities. That's also something that you talk about in your book, right, with the Arab scare, because this is a problem. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And some of these same principles that come out of critical terrorism studies, like understanding non-state violence and state violence as related and influencing each other, is very much informed, and looking at root causes, a holistic understanding, historical context is what informed the approach I took. So we're coming from similar. Yeah, and I think, and then the main point is still, as you said earlier, there are clear, real examples of violence being perpetrated on the left, on the right, by different groups. These are, this is real violence. You cannot hide from it, and you cannot deconstruct it, or you can try, but this, these are events that have real life and real time consequences. So you need to find a way to deal with it, but in a way that is different than what we have been doing. I think this is it's such a difficult element, but so terrorism is one, and I think we were making some progress in the field of counterterrorism, but then it made another development into radicalization. And that really messed up things again, because then you're talking about ideas, radicalizing dangerous ideas. And you see now in the UK,
they have a bill proposed, and it will go through. It will pass through the parliament that that criminalizes in a way protests, saying that if you have protests, that is that disturbs society in making noise. You have to wear a tracking device for up to 5 years, and you also have in the UK, for example, a guideline from the government saying that critique of capitalism could be an indication of radicalization. And so it's morphed into this, with this radicalization paradigm. I mean, it's gotten a lot more difficult because now terrorism, at least for some years, we could actually narrow down. We could start to narrow it down in a way. But then when you get radicalization into it, it just expands into a never-ending. I mean, I don't see the end of it.
Yeah, and I mean, in the United States now, like these ideas of radicalization and law and order are like kind of losing their meaning as the entire Republican Party has lined up behind Donald Trump's false claims that the election was stolen, supporting a violent insurrection in the Capitol, and promoting other violence. So it's really hit a crisis point. But I wanted to ask you, so you also talk about Norwegian terrorism and some of its history, and you're critical of it, but I guess, would you mind for people listening, especially those who are not from Norway listening to this, like, how has Norway handled political violence, including the attacks in 2011, and have they avoided some of the extraordinary measures and excessive responses?
Yeah, in a way, I mean, for like, terrorism was discussed in Norway in the 1990s, but it was sort of rejected in a way because there was small likelihood of it ever happening, so it didn't seem relevant. So they just, we know it's a thing, but it doesn't really, it doesn't really mean much to us. And then 9/11 happened, and that obviously is a catalyst for new laws and measures. But we do have the attacks in 2011, the Breivik attacks, where he blows up part of the the government buildings and kills a lot of young people at a political youth camp at Utøya, and I remember it, vividly. And what happened after is that Norway, in many ways, followed what we call the traditional justice model of counterterrorism. So it was handled by the police, and they actually apprehended him and interrogated him, and then he faced trial at a normal court. Well, it was normal in the sense that it was a lot more security and all that kind of stuff, but it followed the same criminal justice system. It wasn't it wasn't handled with extraordinary measures when it happened and the aftermath. And I think a big point was made to treat him as an ordinary criminal, because he wanted to portray himself as a crusader and defender of the white race and blah blah blah. And then the court, and he didn't acknowledge the Norwegian court, the criminal justice system. And I think that's why it was important to actually treat him as an ordinary criminal who actually killed a lot of people and the worst, criminal in our history. But there's a signaling effect here when you treat him as an ordinary criminal, because he wants to see himself as something bigger, something larger, and then society says nope. But also the police handled it. They got a lot of critique, rightly, because they were not prepared for an event like this. There are horrible images of them in a small dinghy out on the water, and it almost sinks. And you have to have ordinary people coming out to pick them up in boats to get them over. It's like it's really weird. But so the police got a lot of critique. But in general, the Norwegian domestic counterterrorism approach has always been the criminal justice model. So not a war model that we saw in America after 9/11, but a criminal justice model. This is another criminal act, and so that's how they've been dealing with it. And right up until and after the Breivik attacks, what's really interesting is that after the Breivik attacks, Norwegians when they did some polling, they found that Norwegians were less supportive of government interventions or more authoritative measures than before the attacks. So it seems to indicate that Norwegians actually had the recoil of like, well, this is a terrorist attack, an extremist attack. We are then going to go the opposite direction and talk about more democracy and more liberties, right? But then that was after the attacks, and then what we see now, especially with the when ISIS came on the scene, and in later years, Norway has gotten a lot more closer to other countries, especially the UK and other countries, about how they deal with terrorism. So now there's a lot more talk about radicalization, and they implement a lot more measures that that are not, much closer to our neighboring countries, and especially the UK. So Norway has moved a bit away from that traditional criminal justice model into a more preemptive criminal justice model, but that basically means more surveillance, trying to find radical ideas and people who have radical ideas and see if they will go down the factory, like the assembly line, to become a terrorist. That's basically how they changed. So the Norwegian approach has changed a lot since 2014, especially.
Yeah, I have to say that, like, hearing you say that the response to the Breivik attack in Norway is a majority of people, like, wanting to expand democracy. I mean, I emotionally got choked up because that is the opposite of my experience after 9/11. And I think that, those of us who are looking to Norway for inspiration or other models of development or approaches to political violence or of social democracy, we have to avoid romanticizing.
Yep.
But you have a fundamentally different political economy, I think. Because I don't think that response has to do with something biological or like mystical about Norwegians. Like you have a different history than the United States that involves a much larger, substantial social democracy. And I think the model, I know you said you're not an expert on policing in Norway, but like the models of policing there are, and the prison system there is different. I don't think Breivik is being tortured. My understanding of the prison conditions he's in are like nicer than a lot of like,
he's in isolation.
Apartment buildings that people live in. But
he's in isolation, but he has a lot of space, and I think if you go to if you ask people about, is this fair after killing that many people, people will be saying it's incredibly stupid that we actually keep him. I mean, he should be shot. I mean, that's what most people would actually think he deserves. But no, he's in a cell. He's in isolation. For which he actually took Norway to the European Court for breaches on human rights, and Norway actually lost on one of those counts because we do breach his human rights because he is in isolation, but he has to be in isolation because the moment he meets other prisoners, he's dead. That's basically how it works. He'll be killed or severely injured the moment he meets other people. So they have to keep him in isolation, which he's upset about. But I think it's beautiful in a way that Norway, that he's been treated like an ordinary criminal, although he has to be in isolation. That he's actually able to take Norway to court for breaches on human rights. Norway loses, but that's fine. Nobody cares. But I think it's a good thing. I think it seems stupid to a lot of people, but that's how these institutions have to work if they are gonna work. So if you try to think beyond tit for tat, if you're trying to think beyond just punishing people, if that means something for you as a society, this is actually how you have to deal with it. I think so. I like the way that we're dealing with him, and that he's actually been able to sue us or sue Norway, lose, and you have that discussion because that's a functioning criminal justice system. and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I've tried to ask. I'm very much influenced by prison abolitionist ideas and by this, but in recent years, I'm more reluctant to identify with that. And part of the reason is because I've tried to ask people straight up, how do we respond? And I do think that that this model here is important. And so the other thing I want to ask you, if you don't mind, you had mentioned from your perspective in Norway, the idea of defunding police doesn't seem to make sense to you. Could you speak about just in a Norwegian context, or just based on your ideas, why that was the response to my comment earlier?
Well, I think our country's histories are very different. Norway is a much younger state, 1905, more homogeneous population, but also a really small, inconsequential state for most of our history. At least in Euro history, not medieval history, then where we were actually a superpower, but not in recent history. So you have a small country which is kind of an outsider, and where the state actually has to be the main player, because you don't have, like in America, you don't have the enormous resources or the Vanderbilts and other people to sort of be these powerful people that build society in air quotes, but have these companies, and they are really powerful. The only powerful player basically in Norway is a state, and that's been for a long time. But then, so that's one part of it, that we have a tradition of viewing the state as less problematic than other states or countries. You don't have that in America. It's almost funded on a basic mistrust of society, which in political theory makes a lot of sense. But that's not the history in Norway. It's a different history. So there's a lot more trust towards the state, and also because after the Second World War, you did have the Second World War where we lost our state, and then it came back again, in 1945 after Nazi Germany was defeated, and then you had the Labour Party sort of rebuilding social democracy in Norway, and people's lives got better, and then it's like, well, the state can't be all that bad when it's actually doing things for us. So there's a more positive view of the state. I think that's important to note, and then another, key factors and differences, equality. There's a lot less violence. There's a lot more trust in society when there's trust, and when people are equal. Material equality actually matters. Not in a communist sense that everyone has to be equal in material sense, but there has to be, proportionality here. I think it was more J.P. Morgan, the financial banker, who actually once said that, the income inequality in America has to be 1 to 20 is ideal. It shouldn't be more than that a manager or the top brass earn more than 20 times. But in America now, it's between 700 and 1,000. So it means you live in different societies. And I think in those societies, and especially in America with racial segregation, slavery, all that kind of stuff, and then you have that maxim of law and order, that's basically just repression. Whereas we haven't had that in Norway. So I think that's the different kind of history. So that's the historical factors that I think play into, my answer to you. But then there's the other question of pacifism and nonviolence, which I dabble in. Because nonviolence is an important element of my work, but also as you said, my supervisor Richard Jackson. We've done a lot of work on this on nonviolence, but he's much more into pacifism than I am. But then you end up with the question of what does pacifism mean when you meet direct violence, when people don't care about it. What do you do? People break the law, they kill people, they hurt people. What do you do? Because it seems like pacifism is not the answer. And most people tend to agree then, I think, that having a police or an institution that can actually stop people from killing other people So you do, it's then not pacifist, but it's not violence per se, it's force, and you're stopping people from killing other people. I think that seems reasonable, that you need a kind of entity that can actually do that. At least in our history, I think it's possible to create, or you could imagine other societies. But I think that would take a long time. And the problem is that societies have histories. Cultures have histories and norms and values. So trying to, like, say, defund the police, and we can look to some sort of tribe or country or some ancient historical epoch for, like, how the different organization. Well, it could be a good source of inspiration, but you also have to actually start from where you're at. I think that's sort of like how I approach it. If that makes sense, that you have to start from where. I mean, okay, so I'll say this as well. You have to start from where you're at, and then I think in terms of critical theory, which I was sort of brought up in, and then I kind of in some ways left it because it has some problematic normative sides to it, or reconstructive sides to it. But one element that Richard Wynne Jones and other people talked about is that you have to create concrete utopias. So defund the police seems like a wholly impossible project. But maybe you can start with smaller things. That will be concrete utopias. That will help deal with stuff. So to make, and to connect that with my own work on counterterrorism, I don't aim for an end to the war on terror immediately. I think that's impossible. What I'm trying to do is to say, well, we actually have this knowledge from Norway in peace diplomacy that can actually help us prevent terrorism. So let's not bomb a lot of people. Let's tone down the use of drones to cases where we actually know they actually hit the people that they're supposed to, and not just a lot of civilians, which they very often do. So let's scale down on the violence because we know it creates violence. If we can just start there, I think we've realized a concrete utopia, and then we can start building on the next one, and then we can start, building the steps. So that's why I'm saying I think the abolition of prisons or defunding the police it's almost like a totalizing project. I think it's not possible.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think a lot of what you're saying overlaps with a lot of the ideas that prison abolitionist theorists have talked about. But we're at a point now where I think there's both strategy for moving forward to the societies that people are wanting, that are less violent and more just, and the technicalities that you're talking about of dealing with violence in the meantime as it exists. I haven't seen answers on that, and I think you're offering some that are really compelling. So it's really been a pleasure to be able to learn from that and to be in this conversation with you. And I hope we can continue to have these sort of conversations. And
oh yeah, I think it's this is it's interesting stuff, and I can look at my timer. I see we've been going on for a while, so it's gonna be a long podcast for our listeners. But as I told you, before we start recording, that our podcast is sort of shameless in its format, because serious matters needs to you want to talk through them, and if everything is just 15 minutes, it's only going to be bullet points, and it's obvious that these questions are far more complex, I think, than 15-minute podcast. That's fine as well, but more engaging, in-depth conversations are is also needed, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's I think it's fascinating, and I think I guess we can leave our listeners with the problem is how do you create society or create policies that shape society in a different direction that is less violent, which adheres to the means and consistency principle. I think it's good, but it's like, once you start putting out your own ideas, that's kind of scary about how society should be. And I think a problem is that it's very easy to deconstruct and critique, which is needed. But I think you mentioned terrorism, the field of terrorism studies and critical terrorism studies, and my own work was motivated out of the lack of alternatives. There was just 10-15 years of scholarship saying the war on terror is bad, Western states are bad, all that kind of stuff. But then there was like, but what to do about it? Because Western states are engaged in counterterrorism. So what's the alternative? How do you then? And then you have a lot of scholars saying it's pointless to talk to states, because then you become co-opted and you become a lackey of the states. But then it's like, it seems rather defeatist to me if you're not going to work within the system. And I think, to bring it back to your own work, then, with the Weather Underground and all that kind of, these are groups that, I guess, you can, I'll let you have the final words there, but, in my view, Weather Underground, BLA, responding to real cases, but also feeling that the political society in America, or the political system, wasn't able to actually handle this, or they didn't feel like they could actually, there weren't any avenues for them to actually pursue this, policy options. But I'll let you you can sort of finish up on whatever you want. But that I think that's some of the things that I think I took from your book is that and then they took it outside of the ordinary politics and used violence instead to try and communicate their message.
Yeah, thanks. And to finish off, I'm thinking, as I'm talking these last comments, I'm moving even more between the role as a historian, right, and then also as somebody who has my own ideas about politics. Mm-hmm. And those inform each other, but I do try to make that distinction as well. But as I blur it a little bit, I guess two things come to mind. One is that a lot of people on the left who still kind of have romantic views about the Weather Underground or the Black Panthers or the Black Liberation Army, it's interesting, like within prison, those who promote prison abolition, also that they might have this kind of nostalgia for armed struggle or just like promoting street fighting. And, there's a lot of people, there's over 4,000 people arrested during I think it was over 4,000 arrests over the George Floyd protests of 2020. And many people who've been convicted or like, they've really had their lives messed up, and like some of them have had support, some of them haven't. I don't know how many became informants, but we didn't have enough of a real movements with like discipline and organization to even support these people. So so anyway, and besides just not having an infrastructure, intellectually and theoretically, I haven't heard like a lot of prison abolition idea is about nonviolence. So we're I think we need to be clear about, like, I'm not a strict pacifist, but I do think that, the idea of like training, of actually having a society where people's needs are met and police act in a function that's fundamentally different than how American police respond, that is about using nonviolence as much as possible to eliminate violent threats in real time and at the roots, like, is something to really think about how to achieve. I think that it was like, we can understand where those groups are coming from, and I think it was a strategic mistake, and we can learn from that history. And I mean, I don't have all the answers. I do think we've talked about some as alternatives to counterterrorism, but I think in order to have the societies that can have that kind of a counterterrorism, we need to change the political economy, which means mass movements with constituencies, organizations in the labor movement and inside politics. And we're, the left has done it, and I think it has to come on an organized left as well. But there's so much more we could talk about in terms of what the left means in Norway, where you actually have political parties. But,
exactly. Yeah. And I that's the interesting thing, because, when you talk about the left, in America, it's like, it's also hard to, really put that in context in Norway, for example, where where I guess in American terms, even our conservative party will almost be social democratic or communist, right? Because they do support the welfare state. So you have people on the Norwegian right being way left in American politics, which so that's an interesting part. And then, you bring up so many points because and then the left. Nobody attacks themselves better than the left. That's been the problem for centuries, basically. You have so much infighting, and those answers, the answers that they've tried to come up with, in some ways have been either, some of them have been really violent, totalitarian, which is a huge problem. And then you have the concept of, how it's worked in Norway or the Nordic countries, where you have a social democratic society, which, I have to say I'm preferential. I like it. I have lived abroad in different countries and different parts of the world, and enough to come back and make the conclusion that I actually do think this is a good way of setting up our society, and that also goes to your own point. As you say, as a historian, you talk about history, and you try to do that in an objective manner. You follow the documents and all and that kind of stuff, and you do that as a political scientist as well. But then normativity is always part of it, because, and as a Weberian myself, values always guide your research, what you think is important, what you think is interesting. But then, as Marx once put it in his famous thesis on Feuerbach, is just, that philosophers have interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. But that is easily said, and it's so hard to do. So I'm not sure if the right side or the left side, whatever that means, have the answers. But I think maybe we can find some guidelines for actions, as Walter Benjamin put it. And I put up nonviolence as a guideline for action, and that's why I'm not a pacifist. I use it as a guideline for action, which means that I do think nonviolent, and in a way it makes perfect sense, because at least for most of us, and in Norway, you don't carry weapons around, or you don't expect to fight all the time. So society works a lot better when there's trust, and you treat people, in a non-violent manner, to put it crudely. That works a lot better than if you have to fear for your security all the time. So non-violence is actually perfectly sensible for most people. But then you do have to have some institutions or entities that can actually deal with the cases of violence, because you cannot wish that away. So
and that's I'm also having a cognitive dissonance, understanding this, because it's the idea of as an American, not being worried about security, or I went in public schools where there was fights, and I saw weapons, even there's bullies. So it's just, it's not like it's different in different places, but there's guns everywhere. We do have some problems with knives and stabbings in Oslo, and you have some gangs, but it is nothing compared to America, where I see these videos on Twitter, where you have primary schools where they have active shooting drills, or how to hide, how to protect yourself if there's a shooter inside a primary school, and then you have to think this is absolutely nuts. What kind of society is this? I have to say, it may sound judgmental, but it's and then you have people saying, well, you need to arm the teacher. Well, that's fine up until the point where you have a crazy teacher who is then armed with a lot of people, and it's there's no guarantee that you won't get crazy teachers who will then have the means to actually kill a lot of kids. And then there's also the trauma, and we talked about with all this violence, no matter who's carrying it out, left, right, police, the state, military, there's this lasting trauma, and that affects people in profound ways over generations. And so I guess I'm just thinking of that as you're saying this, and in terms of also fundamental, not to romanticize, there's trauma in Norway too. From World War II and the occupation, I'm sure there's a historical trauma, and there's but among other things. But this everyday violence. But well, I think your points about, I think these points are great to kind of be wrapping this up with, and I like the Norwegian social democracy model too.
Yeah,
get me a ticket, Sondre.
Well, I mean, you might end up here, if
I would love to, but we'll see.
If the job market plays out, who knows? You might be coming to Norway, but I do think not to romanticize it at all. There are problems and there are difficulties, but there is a higher level of trust, and it's a more equal society, which I think that anyways that gives people a better platform for dealing with each other in a more humane, proper manner. Whereas where you get massive inequality and you have those histories of violence, it's really hard to bridge. And then people live in gated communities, which is an insane thing in many ways, because that gated community will be that gated community and not engage with other communities, and then these other people becomes means to an end instead of being end. So it's like, it's a never ending, it's a bad spiral to come out of. I'm not sure if America can do it, also because it's a continent. It's not a country, which may be a radical thing, but I've been to all parts of America, and my God, just as a tourist though, but they're different. I like your parts of the country, the Pacific Northwest. That's my favorite part. But they're so different. But my more serious point is there's a lot of history and different in a way cultures, but also take on society, and how to bridge that is really difficult. I guess each state can do it. I guess in a way, but it's just I think it's a lot more complex and difficult to do in America in a way. Than Norway, just because we're so small. I mean, we're basically New York City or less than that, and that's easier to deal with than a massive continent, which America is. So, yeah.
Well, I hear that, but I think you have the pessimism of the intellect, as Gramsci said, but we have the optimism of the will. And I do think that Norway offers a model and an inspiration and something we can learn from.
It's a good way to end on the works of Antonio Gramsci. It's a great quote, and it's something that I actually try to live by. Actually, the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the mind. Let's just say that that's our motto on this podcast.
Takk for at du hørte på Statsvitenskap og sånt. Har du spørsmål, kommentarer eller tilbakemelding, så er det bare å ta kontakt på vår Facebook-side, per e-post eller brevdue. Musikken er som vanlig laget av Robin Horvath, og Mats Halvorsen mikser og redigerer podcasten. Vi høres!